Fallout. One summer day, 3 years after the end of World War II, Harry Gold fell in love. It really happened so, just like that, he said. Here was the girl I'd been searching for all my life. The woman was Mary Lanning, a fellow chemist. She and Gold began dating, and Gold became more and more convinced that this was his shot at happiness. Why not grab it? The war was long since over. Klaus Fuchs was back in Britain. Gold was working in a hospital lab in Philadelphia with no access to valuable secrets and no interest in spying ever again. Why not just live a normal life? It was wishful thinking, and Gold knew it. Mary had no idea what was wrong, but she sensed a disturbing coolness in her boyfriend. Here was a man who was kind and generous. He said he loved her, and yet he always seemed distracted. When Gold asked Lanning to marry him, she hesitated. If he really loved her, she wondered, why the lack of passion? It wasn't a lack of passion she was sensing. It was fear. Fear of exposure, Gold later admitted. And fear not for myself, but a horror at the thought that the disastrous revelation might come after we'd been married for 3 or 4 years with children at home of our own. Gold could confess, tell her everything. She might stick by him. But the basic problem remained. For most of his adult life, Gold had been a spy for the Soviet Union. Was it really possible to get away with something like that? Who knew better than I on what a precarious, tottering house of cards my whole life rested? On a wet and gray morning on the plains of Kazakhstan, 2,000 miles east of Moscow, Igor Khrushchev paced back and forth in a small concrete bunker. Well, well, muttered the head of the Soviet bomb project. Well, well. It was a few minutes before 6 a.m. on August 29, 1949. Outside Khrushchev's bunker, the tall grass bent in the wind. 6 miles away, a steel tower rose 100 feet above the flat land. On a platform at the top of the tower sat the Soviet Union's first atomic bomb. 0 minus 10 minutes. The countdown echoed off the bunker's concrete walls. Khrushchev continued walking and muttering. Crowded into the bunker were the other top Soviet physicists, along with the head of Stalin's secret police, Lavrenti Beria. Beria watched Khrushchev's nervous pacing. He decided to crank up the pressure. Nothing will come of it, Igor, Beria jabbed. Khrushchev shook his head. We'll certainly get it, he insisted. For weeks, the Soviet scientists had been privately discussing what would happen if the bomb test failed. Many expected to be shot. The countdown hit 10 seconds, then 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then, on top of the tower, an unbearably bright light blazed up, one of the Soviet physicists recalled. The white fireball engulfed the tower and expanded rapidly, changing color. It rushed upwards. The bomb was an exact copy of the American implosion bomb tested at Trinity, and the rising, twisting, pulsing ball of fire looked just the same. The steel tower was vaporized. Tanks placed around the tower to test the bomb's strength were tossed into the air. As he watched the bombs glow, brighten low hills in the distance, Khrushchev was hit by the same emotion that had swept over Oppenheimer at Trinity, pure relief. And his first words were identical. It worked. A much more excited Lavrenti Beria hugged and kissed Khrushchev, then ran to the phone and shouted for an immediate connection to Stalin's home. Stalin's secretary picked up in Moscow, where it was 2 hours earlier. He explained to Beria that the Soviet leader was still asleep. Beria said, "Wake him up." The Soviet Union's first atomic bomb exploded with the force of 20,000 tons of TNT. It was too big to hide. Just a few days later, a U.S. force weather plane flying over the western Pacific detected high levels of radiation in the air. Air samples were collected and sent to labs for study. In Washington, D.C., a panel of scientists, including Robert Oppenheimer, analyzed the results. They were quickly convinced that an atomic bomb had exploded somewhere in the Soviet Union, probably on the morning of August 29th. Oppenheimer was not surprised. Just a few months before, he told a reporter, "Our atomic monopoly is like a cake of ice melting in the sun." But President Harry Truman was stunned. His intelligence experts had just told him that the Soviets wouldn't have the bomb until the middle of 1953. How had they built an atomic bomb so quickly? An FBI counterintelligence agent named Robert Lamphere asked himself the same question. Had the Russian scientists actually been several years ahead of our estimates in their progress? Lamphere wondered. Or had they been aided in their effort to build it by information stolen from the United States? The answer lay in a stack of coded telegrams from America by Soviet agents during World War II. While in the United States, Soviet spies had to use an American telegraph company to send information quickly to Moscow. The KGB probably knew that the telegraph company was making copies of every telegram and handing them over to the U.S. Army. This didn't particularly worry the Soviets. The messages were always written in an extremely complex code. In 1949, after years of failure, American code breakers cracked the code. Intelligence agents began decoding all the messages sent to the Soviet Union during the war. That's when they came across a shocking note sent from New York City to KGB headquarters in 1944. In this cable were data and theories that seemed to have come directly from inside the Manhattan Project, Lamphere explained. When I read the KGB message, it became immediately obvious to me that the Russians had indeed stolen crucial research from us and had undoubtedly used it to build their bomb. The 1944 telegram summarized a top secret scientific paper. The paper had been written by one of the British scientists working with Oppenheimer. A few phone calls later, Lamphere had the name of the paper's author, Klaus Fuchs. Lamphere noticed agents of MI5, Britain's military intelligence agency. Notified agents of MI5. After the war, Fuchs had returned to Britain and continued working for the government. By 1949, he'd risen to the head of the Theoretical Physics Division at Harwell, Britain's main atomic research center. One morning, shortly after the Soviet bomb test, a tall, thin man stepped into Fuchs's office. He had identified himself as William Sharpton, an investigator with MI5, and he said he was just doing a routine check. Puffing on a pipe, Skardon asked Fuchs a long series of questions about the scientist's background and family. After 75 minutes of friendly chatter, Skardon suddenly said, "Were you not in touch with a Soviet official or a Soviet representative while you were in New York? And did you not pass on information to that person about your work?" There was a long silence. Fuchs sat perfectly still. Even his face remained frozen. Finally, he said, "I don't think so." At that moment, Skardon knew the man was guilty, but he had no evidence. The coded Soviet telegrams couldn't be used in a public court because the Americans didn't want the Soviets to know they had broken their code. Sure, Fuchs had been a communist back in his college days, but that was hardly proof that he was a Soviet spy. Skardon repeated the charge anyway, just to get a reaction. "I don't understand," Fuchs said. "Perhaps you will tell me what the evidence is." Skardon declined, moved on to other subjects, and said a polite goodbye. He questioned Fuchs several more times over the next few weeks. Fuchs continued to deny everything, though the pressure was getting to him. At home, alone at night, he considered suicide. On January 22, 1950, Fuchs called Skardon. He said he wanted to talk. Skardon came to Fuchs's house. "You asked to see me, and here I am," the investigator said. "Yes," said Fuchs. "It's rather up to me now." "When did it start?" asked Skardon. "It started in 1942. "Tell me, just to give me a better picture, what was the most important information you passed over?" Perhaps the most important thing was the full design of the atom bomb. Harry Gould's fear of exposure had ruined his relationship with Mary Lanning. Alone again, he tried to focus on his job, always wondering when his house of cards would come crashing down. When he read newspaper accounts of the arrest of Klaus Fuchs in Britain, he knew it would be soon. On Monday, May 15, 1950, FBI agents Scott Miller and Richard Brennan came to the Philadelphia hospital lab where Gould worked. "Even before they showed me their identification, I knew who they were," Gould recalled. The agents asked Gould to come down to the bureau offices to answer a few questions. They were curious about men Gould had worked with during the war, and, they added, some other matters. Gould was questioned for 5 hours that night, but the questions were general. There was no accusation of spying. On Tuesday, he noticed two men in suits following him. On Wednesday, while he was at work, an agent poked his head into the lab. "I thought I'd stop in and see what your place was like," the man said with a smile. Gold showed the agent around. When they chatted politely, but the mood was tense. Both were pretending that this was just a friendly visit, but knew it wasn't. I'm under surveillance, Gold kept thinking. Why? What do they know? Agents Miller and Brennan brought Gold to FBI head offices for questioning again on Thursday, but they didn't accuse him of anything. Not yet. Then, after a 9-hour session on Friday night, Brennan handed Gold a photograph. Do you know who he is? Gold looked at the photo. It was the pale, sad, owl like face of Klaus Fuchs. I do not know him, Gold said, desperately trying to sound calm. I recognize the picture of that of Dr. Fuchs, the Briton who got in trouble over there, but I don't know him. I've never been in England. Oh, yes, you know him. You met him in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Never been there in my life. As with Fuchs, the agents had no proof that Gold was a spy. Fuchs had described Gold's appearance but didn't know Gold's real name. Fuchs had also told investigators that his American contacts seemed to know a lot about chemistry, but that was hardly evidence. The FBI needed to force Gold to confess, or they had no case. That's why they were keeping him under constant surveillance and conducting late night interrogations. The agents were hoping to wear Gold down, to confuse him, to make him lose hope. And it was working. After 2 more long interviews on Saturday and Sunday, the agents mentioned they could settle the matter once and for all by taking a quick look into Gold's house. Gold had the legal right to refuse, but decided there was no point. What would happen, and that was all. He later said of his thinking at this critical moment. Possibly it was the sheer and utter exhaustion of the past week which had produced this reaction in me. The next morning, May 22nd, Gold ate breakfast at home with his brother and father. When they put on their coats to leave for work, Gold was still in his pajamas. I have to work home today, he told them. He said goodbye, and they left. Gold looked at the clock. The FBI would be there any moment. Shaking off his fatigue, Gold decided to make use of what little time remained. He started quickly up the stairs to his bedroom. He had a few more minutes to destroy 17 years of evidence.